last week we saw that there is a power, the little horn power, that actually claims to have done what God said it would do. It claims to have changed God's law. In particular, it claims to have changed the Sabbath day from Saturday to Sunday. However, there are many sincere Christians who believe that Christ or the apostles changed the day of worship. Is this true? We need to know. It is a wonderful thing that when God made our first parents, He gave them each other for companionship. Adam had spent many hours searching amongst the other animals, looking for someone to be a suitable companion for him. When he found none, God made a companion for him out of Adam's own rib. Imagine Adam's cry of wonder and delight when God brought her to him. All man's needs were met in that one gift that God gave to them both, the gift of companionship with each other. Did I say all of their needs? Well, not quite. There was another gift that was even more important to them, the gift of companionship with God Himself. They may not have realised the importance of this at first, for God had been with them from their very first moments. But as the sun was going down and the evening gathered darkness around them, they may well have been a little apprehensive if God had not still been there with them. As they drifted towards sleep that first night, God would have told them that He was planning to spend the whole of the next day with them. And I'm sure that they would have been filled with excitement as God told them what He was planning to share with them. We read about this day in Genesis chapter 2, starting from verses 2 and 3. And on the seventh day, God ended His work which He had made, and He rested on the seventh day from all His work which He had made. And God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it, because that in it He had rested from all His work which God created and made. God would have told Adam and Eve that He had set aside every seventh day to spend with them. What a joy it would have been to them both. Just how many Sabbath days they would have spent with God in the Garden of Eden before they had to leave it, we are not told. But I'm sure that it would have been a matter of great sadness to them that after they had to leave the garden, their Maker was no longer visibly present with them each seventh day as it came around. Eventually, in the fullness of time, as Paul said, Jesus came to earth to be among us. He was our Maker, our Creator. Did you know that? Paul tells us in Colossians chapter 1, verse 16, "For by Him were all things created that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible. All things were created by Him and for Him." Who is Paul talking about? Verse 14 tells us, "In whom we have redemption through His blood, even the forgiveness of sins." So, our Creator, the one who had been with Adam and Eve in the garden, had now come to be with us in a form in which we sinful human beings could behold Him. Just as He had been with Adam and Eve in a special way each Sabbath day, so He was now with them in a special way on the Sabbath. We read about this in Luke 4:16. And he came to Nazareth, where he had been brought up. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up for to read. So it was Jesus' custom or habit to be with his people each Sabbath day in the synagogue. What a blessing it would have been for them to have experienced that, to have listened to the gracious words which he spake. How wonderful it would be for us to have Jesus here visibly with us tonight. You'd have someone better to listen to than me. On one occasion, Jesus said he was Lord of the Sabbath. Matthew 12 verse 8 tells us, "For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day." Why wouldn't he be Lord of the Sabbath, seeing that he had made it in the first place? And since he is the Lord of the Sabbath, why would he want to set about to change it? The fact is, he did not change it. You may read the Bible from cover to cover, and you will not find a single place where Jesus changed the Sabbath or said that he would change it. In fact, Jesus clearly indicated that he expected his followers would be still faithfully keeping the Sabbath many years after his death. Speaking of the time leading up to the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70, Jesus gave his disciples a sign that would enable them to flee before the destruction took place. He then went on to say, "But pray ye that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day." For 40 years the Christians living in Jerusalem prayed this prayer, and indeed they did escape. They fled to the little city of Pella, part of which we see here in ruins as it is today. Not one of the Christians perished, we're told. No, Jesus did not change the Sabbath, but he did do something very significant concerning it. One of the Old Testament prophecies describing the work of the coming Messiah said, "The Lord is well pleased for his righteousness' sake. He will magnify the law and make it honourable." You see, God had designed that the Sabbath would be a joy and a blessing to his people. The Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, Jesus said to them in Mark 2:27. And in Isaiah 58:13 and 14 we read, "And call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord, honourable, and shalt honour him, not doing thy own ways, nor finding thine own pleasure, nor speaking thine own words. Then shalt thou delight thyself in the Lord, and I will cause thee to ride upon the high places of earth." By the time of Jesus, the Jews had developed a legalistic, rigid, letter of the law approach to the keeping of the Sabbath. Jesus said concerning this, in Matthew 23 verse 4, "For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers." Many of these burdens related to the way the Sabbath should be kept. We read about them in the Mishnah, a Hebrew writing from just after the time of Christ. And in that there are hundreds of such rules and regulations. For example, concerning the putting out of an oil lamp on the Sabbath, it says, "If one extinguish the light for fear of non-Jews or of robbers or of melancholia, or to enable a sick person to sleep, he is absolved But if his intention be to spare the lamp, or to save the oil, or to preserve the wick, he is guilty. Another rule. They may set a vessel under the lamp to catch the sparks, but one may not put water therein, since that would be extinguishing. Another one. One must not tie camels together and lead them along, but he may gather the ropes in his hand and lead them, provided he does not twist the ropes together.
It's ludicrous.
Thank you. I think the same. Another one. If anyone carry out anything in his right hand or in his left hand, in his bosom or on his shoulder, he is liable for breaking the Sabbath. For this is the method of carrying. But if upon the back of the hand, or with his foot, or with his mouth, or with his elbow, or in his ear, or in his hair, or in his wallet with the opening downward, or between his wallet and his shirt, or in the hem of his skirt, or in his shoe, or in his sandal, he is exempt, because he did not take out in the manner that people take out. Another one. If one plucked anything from a plant pot with a hole, he is culpable. But from one which has no hole, he is exempt. Listen to this one. If fire broke out on the night of the Sabbath, they may save, that broke out in the house, they may save food sufficient for 3 meals. If during the morning, they may save food enough for 2 meals. If in the afternoon, sufficient food for 1 meal. Oh, I forgot to mention that if a fire started in one's house on the Sabbath day, it was not lawful to put it out. This kind of mentality still exists in the nation of Israel. There, in tall buildings, they have Sabbath lifts. On the Sabbath day, they stop at all floors, so that no one will have to push a button. I pity the poor person living on the top floor. In the time of Christ, healing was regarded as a kind of work. Thus, one could put a plaster on a sore if it was to prevent the sore getting worse, but not if it was to make the sore any better. So Jesus set about restoring the Sabbath to a place of honour and joy. He particularly made a point of showing that mercy should be shown to the sick on the Sabbath by performing a number of healing miracles on the Sabbath. This the Jews were vehemently opposed to. In Matthew, Mark and Luke, the first recorded public miracle on the Sabbath was that of the man with a withered hand. We read the story in Matthew chapter 12. And behold, there was a man which had a hand withered. And they asked him, saying, Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath days? That they might accuse him. And he said unto them, What man shall there be among you that shall have one sheep? And if it fall into a pit on the Sabbath day, will he not lay hold on it and lift it out? How much then is a man better than a sheep? Wherefore it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Then said he to the man, Stretch forth thy hand. And he stretched it forth, and it was restored whole, like as the other. Then the Pharisees went out and held a council against him, how they might destroy him. Likewise with the first Sabbath miracle that John records, the man at the pool of Bethesda. Reading from John chapter 5, "And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity 38 years. When Jesus saw him lie, and knew that he had now been there a long time, in that case, he said unto him, Wilt thou be made whole? The impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man when the water is troubled to put me into the pool, but while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed, and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath." Then down to verse 16. "Therefore did the Jews persecute Jesus, and sought to slay him, because he had done these things on the Sabbath day." In both instances, the Jews sought to kill Jesus. They believed that they should be the ones to decide what should and what should not be done on the Sabbath day. They did not want someone else being Lord of the Sabbath. However, this did not deter Jesus. He went ahead with his work of restoring the Sabbath to its rightful place as a day of rest and blessing. He performed a number of other miracles of healing on the Sabbath to reinforce his statement that it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath days. Would Jesus do this and put his life on the line for an institution that was about to pass away? That would not make any sense at all. After Jesus' death, we find that the women kept the Sabbath day holy. Luke 23, 54 to 56 says, "And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also which came with him from Galilee followed after, and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid. And they returned, and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day according to the commandment." Likewise with the apostles. We have the example of Paul in Acts 17, 1 and 2. They came to Thessalonica, where was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul, as his manner was, went in unto them, and 3 Sabbath days reasoned with them out of the Scriptures. We read earlier that it was Jesus' custom to go to the synagogue, the Jewish church, each Sabbath day. Now we read that Paul had the same manner or custom. It is the same Greek word in both verses. Had the same manner or custom that Jesus did. He went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day. The story in Acts chapter 13 is particularly significant. We will start at verse 14. "But when they departed from Perga, they came to Antioch in Pisidia, and went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day, and sat down. And after the reading of the law and the prophets, the rulers of the synagogue sent unto them, saying, Ye men and brethren, if ye have any word of exhortation for the people, say on." And then we have the record of Paul's wonderful sermon on that day. When he had finished, we read, "And when the Jews were gone out of the synagogue, the Gentiles besought that these words might be preached to them the next Sabbath." This was a golden opportunity for Paul to tell the Gentiles that they did not need to wait until the next Sabbath, for tomorrow, Sunday, was the new Christian Sabbath, and he would teach them then. But no, there was no such thing as a new Christian Sabbath. So it was not until the next Sabbath that Paul preached to the Gentiles. We are told, and the next Sabbath day, came almost the whole city together to hear the word of God. How wonderful that there was such a response. Now, while Paul may have said some things about the law that some people have misunderstood, he was very clear that the commandments are to be our code of conduct. For example, we have 1 Corinthians 7:19, and I'm reading it from the Weymouth translation, which gives the correct sense of the Greek. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Obedience to God's commandments is everything. The Ten Commandments are the only part of the Holy Scriptures actually written by God's own finger, and he wrote them on stone to show their enduring nature. Much of what was written in ancient times on papyrus or parchment or on clay tablets did not survive to our day. However, the things written on stone remain. They are some of the most important records we have. So God wrote his Ten Commandments in stone. Now this reminds me that we have not yet read together the fourth commandment, the Sabbath command. It is found in Exodus 20, starting at verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days shalt thou labour and do all thy work. But the seventh day is the Sabbath of the Lord thy God. In it thou shalt not do any work. Thou, nor thy son, nor thy daughter, thy manservant, nor thy maidservant, nor thy cattle, nor thy stranger that is within thy gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that in them is, and rested the seventh day. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. This takes us right back to the time of creation and reminds us that at that time God rested on the Sabbath, not because he needed rest, but to set us an example. God blessed the Sabbath day and he hallowed it, or set it aside for holy purposes. It is remarkable that the one command that God asks us to remember, some have purposely chosen to forget. It does take a conscious effort to remember which day it is and to keep track of the days of the week. A number of times I have lost track of what day it is. I'm grateful for computers and mobile phones that I can check on to make sure what day it is, but they haven't always been available. An officer of the General Conference of Seventh-day Adventists once embarrassed himself awfully. He was out mowing his front lawn and waving to his friends as they drove by, not realising that they were all going to Sabbath worship. So God told us that we need to remember to keep track of the days of the week. It is not surprising, therefore, that many people ask, how do we know which day is the Sabbath? How do we know that someone did not make a mistake somewhere along the line? Or has there been a change in the calendar? Yes, there has been a change in the calendar. We will look at that now, and first we will ask, why was the change necessary? As you would know, the length of the year is determined by how long it takes for the Earth to travel round the Sun. For many years, it was thought that the year was 365 and a quarter days long. Julius Caesar made his calendar based on this assumption. February has 28 days, except every fourth year it has 29 days. That year is called a leap year. The extra day every 4 years is necessary because of the quarter of a day that is extra in each year. It has since been found that the year is not 365 and a quarter or 365.25 days, but is actually 365.2424 days. The difference is 0.0076 days. What difference does that little bit make, you might ask? Over a long period of time, it all adds up. Over 1,000 years, the little bits have added up to 7.5 days. There have been 7 too many leap years in that time. If one were to keep going on in this way, the calendar would be completely out of line with the seasons. The northern hemisphere will eventually have a summer Christmas. So in the 1500s, it was decided that a correction had to be made. There had been too many leap years since the Julian calendar was started, 10 of them by that time. This meant that the calendar was 10 days ahead of where it should have been. To make things right, we had to have a month that was 10 days shorter than normal. The initial proposal was that the last day of the Julian calendar was Thursday, the 4th of October, 1582. And this was followed by the first day of the Gregorian calendar, Friday, the 15th of October, 1582. Notice that the weekly cycle was not affected. Thursday was followed by Friday. Not all countries adopted the new calendar when it was first proposed. For example, Britain and the British Empire, including the eastern part of what is now the United States, adopted the Gregorian calendar in 1752, by which time it was necessary to correct by 11 days. Wednesday, the 2nd of September 1752 was followed by Thursday, the 14th of September 1752. Again, the weekly cycle was not affected. Wednesday was followed by Thursday. There is really no difference in principle from the case of an ordinary leap year. In a leap year there is an extra day, February 29, but we all know it doesn't affect the days of the week. The Gregorian calendar makes sure that we do not have too many leap years in the future by omitting leap years on specified century years. But none of that answers the question, how do we know which day of the week is the Sabbath? Adam and Eve, of course, would have known, and they would have passed that knowledge on to their children. From then on, it is conceivable that someone in the line of the patriarchs might have forgotten. But I would suggest to you that God knew which day was the Sabbath when he sent the manna to the children of Israel in the desert. You may recall that this took place before they came to Mount Sinai where the Ten Commandments were given. God performed several miracles at that time which highlighted which day was the Sabbath. On Friday there was twice as much manna as normal. On the Sabbath there was none. The manna which was kept over for the Sabbath kept perfectly well, but on any other day, any manna kept over bred worms and stank. These miracles kept happening for 40 long years. But there is something else remarkable about the story of the manna. God did not have to tell the people which day was which. On Friday, the people automatically gathered twice as much so that they would have food for the Sabbath. The rulers of the people were concerned about this and came to Moses to complain. They would not have had to do this if Moses had already told them what to do. Listen to the story as it unfolds in Exodus 16, reading from verse 22. And it came to pass that on the 6th day they gathered twice as much bread, 2 omers for one man. And all the rulers of the congregation came and told Moses. And he said unto them, This is that which the Lord hath said. Tomorrow is the rest of the holy Sabbath unto the Lord. Bake that which you will bake today, and seethe or boil that which you will seethe. And that which remaineth over lay up for you to be kept until the morning. And they laid it up until the morning, as Moses bade, and it did not stink, neither was there any worm therein. So we see that there had been no loss of time. No one had lost track of the days of the week. Over the 1,000+ years from creation to the exodus from Egypt. The people knew to gather twice as much on Friday before they were told to. You see, although an individual may occasionally lose track of the days of the week, a group of people will not all make the same mistake at the same time. So also, as we would expect, there has been no interruption in the weekly cycle from the Exodus until the time of Christ, another 1,000+ years. How do we know? If there had been something wrong with the weekly cycle, Jesus would certainly have had something to say about it, but he didn't. What he did do was to show people the correct way to keep the Sabbath, not in the legalistic letter of the law manner of the Jews, but in the joy of relieving the sufferings of others, as we have seen. What about now? How do we know now, 2,000 years after the time of Christ, which day is the Sabbath? I remember clearly one evening when I was at Lismore, as I mentioned before. I was studying the Bible with an elderly couple. They had been presented with the matter of the Sabbath, and the wife was particularly concerned with the question of how we could know which day is the Sabbath. So we turned to the following passage, part of which we've already read. And behold, there was a man named Joseph, a counsellor, and he was a good man and just. This man went unto Pilate and begged the body of Jesus. And he took it down and wrapped it in linen, and laid it in a sepulchre that was hewn in stone, wherein never man before was laid. And that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. And the women also which came with him from Galilee followed after, and beheld the sepulchre, and how his body was laid. And they returned and prepared spices and ointments, and rested the Sabbath day, according to the commandment. Now upon the first day of the week, very early in the morning, they came unto the sepulchre, bringing the spices which they had prepared, and certain others with them. And they found the stone rolled away from the sepulchre, and they entered in, and found not the body of the Lord Jesus. She read the passage once, and did not get it. She read it the second time, and still did not get it. She read it the third time, and it was like a light bulb going on. Oh, she said, so the Sabbath is the day between Friday and Sunday. I see it now. That same week, she and her husband, who had been listening in, kept their first seventh-day Sabbath. We all know that Jesus was crucified on Friday. Good Friday it is called. It is called the preparation in the Gospel. because everything was prepared on that day for the next day, the Sabbath. And we all know that Jesus rose on the Sunday, called here the first day of the week. Many Christians claim that is why they observe that day as their day of worship. The Sabbath day is wedged firmly between these 2 days, between Friday and Sunday. We can be sure that there has been no losing track of the days of the week between Christ's day and our own. The Sabbath we have today is the same Sabbath Jesus kept and risked his mission for. Now there is one Sabbath healing that is of particular interest. It is recorded in Mark 1, starting at verse 29. And forthwith, when they were come out of the synagogue, they entered into the house of Simon and Andrew with James and John. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, and anon they tell him of her. And he came and took her by the hand and lifted her up, and immediately the fever left her, and she ministered unto them. And at even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were possessed, all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils. And all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. So they came out of the synagogue. When they got to Peter's house, Jesus healed his mother-in-law, who was too sick to make it to the synagogue that Sabbath day. This highlights the importance of mothers-in-law to us. However, the rest of the people of Capernaum waited until after the Sabbath, and then brought their sick to Jesus to be healed. Notice what it says. And at even, when the sun did set, they brought unto him all that were diseased, and them that were possessed with devils. Why was that? God had given the instruction to the children of Israel concerning the timing of Sabbath observance. In Leviticus 23:32, from even unto even shall ye celebrate your Sabbath. Right from the time of the creation, the days have been reckoned as beginning in the evening. Genesis 1:5 says, and the evening and the morning were the first day. And here in our story, we can clearly see that the evening begins at the setting of the sun. This way of reckoning the days, and particularly the Sabbath, from sunset to sunset, is of importance to us so that we can observe the Sabbath as God intended, but also in our understanding of the biblical account of the burial and resurrection of Jesus. You remember that we read, and that day was the preparation, and the Sabbath drew on. The Sabbath was drawing on because it started at sunset, not midnight as one might have imagined. Jesus died at about 3 p.m, and all the women had time to do before the Sabbath was to follow Jesus to his burial, then return home and prepare the anointing spices. Then, when the sun set, they rested on the Sabbath according to the commandment. We have seen that Jesus did not change the Sabbath day. However, something that the apostles changed it. Is that so? There are 2 verses which people think shows that they did. We will look at these now. The first is Paul's instruction to the believers in Corinth. Now concerning the collection for the saints, as I have given order to the churches of Galatia, even so do ye. Upon the first day of the week, that every one of you lay by him in store as God hath prospered him, that there be no gatherings when I come." This was a collection for the poor believers in Jerusalem. Paul was making this collection to take it with him as he travelled by the churches on his way to Jerusalem. He did not want a last-minute hasty collection, but a considered, thoughtful provision as God had prospered. This setting aside of funds was to be done at home, as, for example, the Weymouth New Testament has it. "Let each of you put on one side and store up at his home whatever gain God has granted to him." There is no indication here of Sunday observance, but rather the opposite. Next, we will consider the instance of Paul's midnight talk recorded in Acts. You may recall that on this occasion, a young lad named Eutychus fell out of the window and was killed as a result, and Paul raised him to life. The story begins in Acts chapter 20, verse 7. "And upon the first day of the week, when the disciples came together to break bread, Paul preached unto them, ready to depart on the morrow, and continued his speech until midnight." This was a farewell party for Paul. It happened on the dark part of the first day of the week. As we have seen, this was after sunset on what we would call Saturday night. After the accident with Eutychus falling out the window, Paul kept talking. When he therefore was come up again, and had broken bread, and eaten, and talked a long while, even till the break of day, so he departed. And he went before to ship, and we went before to ship, and sailed unto Assos, there intending to take in Paul, for so he had appointed, minding himself to go afoot. The next day, Sunday, after being up all night, Paul made the arduous journey on foot from Troas to Assos. You see pictured here. That's from Google Earth. It's a journey of about 20 miles through mountainous country. Now, he wouldn't have taken a straight line as I've drawn here. He would have gone out through the mountains and down this way here, probably. Wesley calls it a difficult and dangerous journey. Would Paul have stayed up all night and then undertaken this journey on foot if that day had been the new Christian Sabbath? I hardly think so. And so we see that neither Jesus changed the Sabbath nor the apostles. It happened later in the history of the Christian church, as we saw last week. How could they think to do this? How could they possibly think that they had the right to change God's holy commandments? There are two verses that give us a clue. Speaking to the elders of the church of Ephesus, near the end of his final missionary journey, Paul said, "For I know this, that after my departing shall grievous wolves enter in among you, not sparing the flock. Also of your own selves shall men arise, speaking perverse things, to draw away disciples after them." So even from among the elders of the church, these things would happen. This was not going to be just a local deviation, as can be seen from what Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. Speaking of the second coming of Jesus, he said, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come, except there come a falling away first, and that man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, who opposeth and exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he, as God, sitteth in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. Here Paul is describing the rise of the Antichrist power that we talked about last time, the little horn power, the one who was to try to change God's law. Paul said it would come as a result of a falling away or apostasy from the truth. Wesley comments on this verse, unless the falling away from the pure faith of the gospel come first. This began even in the apostolic age. However, in many respects, the Pope has an indisputable claim to those titles. He is, in an emphatical sense, the man of sin, as he increases all manner of sin above measure. And he is, too, properly styled the son of perdition, as he has caused the death of numberless multitudes, both of his opposers and his followers, destroyed innumerable souls, and will himself perish everlastingly. Here it is that opposeth himself to the emperor, once his rightful sovereign, and that exalteth himself above all that is called God or that is worshipped, suffering himself not once only to be styled God or vice God. Indeed, no less is implied by his ordinary title, Most Holy Lord or Most Holy Father, so that he sitteth enthroned in the temple of God, declaring himself that he is God, claiming the prerogatives which belong to God alone. It is indeed an amazing thing that the apostasy should go so far. But it is a warning to us that any deviation from God's way will, unless repented of, lead us further and further away from God, and will result in our ultimate ruin. And so, in these last days, God is calling for a return to his ways. To do this, we must retrace our steps back to the ways of Christ and the apostles, when, among other things, the keeping of the Sabbath was a matter of great joy in fellowship with Christ. We will want to continue the work of Christ in restoring the Sabbath to its rightful place of honour. This work was foretold by the prophet Isaiah. And they that shall be of thee shall build the old waste places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. If thou turn thy foot from the Sabbath, from doing thy pleasure on my holy day, and call the Sabbath a delight, the holy of the Lord honourable. The prophet John likewise referred to God's true church in the last days when he exclaimed, "Here are they that keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus." Why wouldn't they be keeping God's commandments? Jesus said, "If you love me, you will obey my commandments." Jesus wants us to keep his commandments, and we will do if we love him. He especially wants us to remember his Sabbath day, that he went to such pains to restore to its rightful place of honour and blessing. We are all headed for the kingdom, aren't we? In the kingdom we will all be keeping the Sabbath day holy. Did you know that? Isaiah chapter 66 verses 22 and 23 says, "For as the new heavens and the new earth which I will make shall remain before me, saith the Lord, so shall your seed and your name remain. And it shall come to pass, that from one new moon to another, and from one Sabbath to another, shall all flesh come to worship before me, saith the Lord. Every month we will gather to eat of the tree of life, for it yields its fruit every month, we are told. And every Sabbath we will gather to worship our God, our Creator and our Redeemer. We will be Sabbath keepers then. Let's be Sabbath keepers now. Not to earn our salvation. Jesus has done this on the cross for us, but because we love him, the one who died for us. Let us enter into the joy of our Lord now, as we worship him on the Sabbath day which he restored for us. How many of you are prepared to make that commitment now? Will you raise your hands? God bless you. God bless you. And any of you who are watching on your television screens, if you've also made that commitment, may God bless you.